Okay. And I'll ask her what the procedure is.
My name is number
Yep.
stuff?
Yep. If you could, that would be great.
Just so you know, and don't drive yourself crazy, the school's connection to the outside world over the
It's okay. The Adam came in during the break and said that the university tonight is just disconnected from the internet. It's because something's crashed in the computer, so it's quite wonderful, actually. Case in point. So that's really going to cause massive consternation for anyone doing papers and many other things, and surfing and stuff like this. So we'll just leave this up. Can't be displayed, because nothing can be displayed at this point, which is really sort of nice, because it sort of gives us a little time to, when you have dead technologies, you have a little time to reflect on the technology. Yeah.
At least books can't crash right now. That's one good thing.
Well, these books are wonderful. The books. How could I ever say anything? I would never say anything terrible about books at all, because the points are really true. Because when we go into the discussions on like virtuality, then really you think everything that people interested, like euphoric about technology will say, you just take it back to the reader of a book's imagination and say, okay, what is the meaning of virtuality in any event? Or if you're interested, like in the visual arts, for example. I mean, the visual arts have always depended on virtualities of imagination and time that moves backwards and forwards in different forms of space. So hopefully what we'll do in the discussion of these books, because there's so many good people sitting in the class, is that in fact like really urgent questions and really good criticisms and reflections will be brought with and against each of the readings themselves. And sort of like, so I think the best way to read any book is to do what the thinker Michel Foucault said of Nietzsche. He said, how do you read Nietzsche? He said, read him with do a lot of violence to Nietzsche. He said, because you really do honor to an author by really insisting that the author respond to your own pressing questions. And everybody in here that's spoken really has, and undoubtedly everyone that hasn't spoken really has pressing questions. And so each of these texts that we're going to deal with in this class should really be, just really forced to summon their reasons. And so, which sort of brings me right into the introduction, the first introduction by David Bill, which is a user's guide, and it's followed by an introduction by the other co-editor, Barbara Kennedy, called The Virtual Machine. And David Bill really begins his introduction by saying that. He's saying, in fact, the book that he was really influenced by in thinking this is a book that, if you haven't read it, you're not responsible for in any way whatsoever. But in the future, if you stumble across it, you might want to take a look at it. It's a book by two French thinkers called Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari, a book called A Thousand Plateaus, another book called Anti-Oedipus. And particularly A Thousand Plateaus, this book has really deeply influenced the way in which the editor of this book put the book together. And it influenced the book in a certain way, because he said, like Deleuze says, if you're reading a text, why do you have to think that a text goes from having a beginning point to an end point? Why can't you sort of cut into a text like you cut into, you're listening to a CD, cut into something you're interested in, cut out? Why, in fact, do you have to believe the storyline that an author has given you? Why can't, in fact, as you read a book, in fact, begin to develop your own storyline? Why should a text be just sort of, text on a page? Why, when you read these texts, as I think you'll find when you come to, articles that you find interesting, like on making cyborgs, making humans, or cyberspace in the world we live in, or Donna Haraway's A Cyborg Manifesto, these really fundamental pieces of work. Why, in fact, should you have to even read the whole text? I hate to say that at the beginning of a course, but isn't the normal way of reading a text is you read and you read until you engage with the text at some point, some turn of phrase is said, and suddenly your own thinking begins to take over the text, and you in fact follow like a line of flight. And the text itself takes you into different things. And at that point, when in fact your own thinking begins to be integrated with the author at the text is saying, in fact it's no longer simply words on a page or text on a page, it's something much more animate than that. It's really a text which really becomes alive. And this practice is the practice of the practice that David Bill urges in a user's guide. He says really we shouldn't read just from start to finish. We shouldn't read just within the lines, but we should do a style of reading today that perhaps follows how we do the net. We should follow the thread. We should in fact follow lines of flight which move throughout the text itself. And if you find yourself, for example, in text, if you're not a tech utopian, as many of you aren't, there's a lot of very healthy tech skepticism here. If you're reading these phrases like we're going to read a wonderful article, I don't agree with it, but I really think it's just a really beautiful expression. Michael Benedict's Cyberspace First Steps from an anthropological perspective, but a very deeply utopian, mythological perspective on technology. If you find yourself reading that text and not agreeing with it, then that's really to be encouraged, and you should intensify, though, exactly your grounds for disagreeing with it. And by intensifying your grounds for disagreeing with it, you then begin to break down like the hierarchy of an author and a reader, and you become like the author of the text yourself. You begin to like deauthorize the text. You begin, in fact, to create a new line of flight across text, and you're in effect writing a new book itself. So like at some point, either in the first or second exam, I'll ask you either to write like a short article for this book, or write a preface or a conclusion to the text itself, so that you're not, as readers, we're not sort of standing outside a textbook, but actually, really investing ourselves in it and sort of taking control of it in some ways. So David Bell begins the user's guide by saying that this book itself is set up to try to set up a type of reading that is the reading way in which we understand things within a technological age. And he's got a basic political principle on this. He says, why, if we live in a technological age, do we have to follow the old modernist hierarchies? Author, reader, text, sort of subject, readerly subject. Why, in fact, can't we do another kind of reading that's illegitimate? It's what Deleuze and Guattari, speaking from France, call rhizomatic reading. And you come across this word, rhizomatic reading, like the roots in a strawberry patch, for example. Why, instead of thinking about the great tree of knowledge, why don't we think about this text as having just sort of a root structure? It's sort of telling a story about technology that begins and ends, not necessarily consistent or inconsistent, and really awaits us to make our own judgments on the text itself. So their advice for doing this book is to do what everyone's done in terms of the educated imagination. And that is trust your senses, follow hunches, play around with terms of being today. Like, don't avoid necessarily technological terms, but think about those terms. Like when you think about like terms which have just entered into the vernacular, like downloading and editing and rebooting and memory, well, what do these terms actually mean in terms of our own life? Like, are screensavers just something that are on a computer screen? Or are a lot of people adept today at putting on what a friend of mine calls their screensaver face? You're being interviewed for a job, and you've got to be corporate for the day. So you put on your corporate screensaver face. Or you're in gamer culture and you have another kind of screensaver face. Or what happens to memory when the notion of downloading memory is no longer simply a term within computer culture, but people speak about themselves, like if you watch television talk shows. A lot of people now will say things, well, I downloaded that to my file, and then you realize they're not talking about a computer, they're talking about their own memories. Or I need to reboot myself today. What happens to a culture when the very terms of computer culture, sort of return to ourselves as the ways in which we imagine ourselves and the ways we think about ourselves? So in his introduction, David Bell says in the user's guide, he says, well, maybe what we should do as a way of like understanding the world in which we live is to not avoid, the terms of cyberculture, but really just to make them come alive and say, well, what happens when the terms of cyberculture that we thought was describing something outside of ourselves suddenly becomes very, primal, something very essential to our identity? So his sort of first, lesson itself. His second lesson he gives, he says, what is cyberspace? in the introduction. He says we find ourselves like sitting sort of in front of a computer monitor. And, we think that that there's a division between our bodies and the machine. But he says maybe what we're sort of unaware of is that we are simultaneously making ourselves over as data, as bits, as codes, that we're relocating ourselves in the space behind the screen, between screens. If we can believe in certain kinds of hype that the tech utopians want to say, in the age of the internet, you don't have to be what you are in your biology. You can actually be different persons on the internet. You can have different persona. And there's a number of articles in this text, particularly the articles in identity tourism and stealing identities, that really talk exactly like this. What are the manifestations of having multiple identities on the internet? And what are the politics of having, in gender politics particularly, of having different identities on the internet itself? So David Bell's introduction begins by talking of these, and his introduction also then says one third thing. It says that a dominant way of representing technology in this book is the notion of the cyborg. And like we all know the cyborg from movies, like from Matrix and from AI to some extent, but from films almost like RoboCop and RoboCulture, like big hulking machines. But what happens when the image of the cyborg has nothing to do with big hulking robotic machines, but the image of the cyborg means the wiring of human bodies into the internet, the wiring of human bodies into vast archives of data. What happens when, in fact, the cyborg is not some cinematic representation which we're waiting for either expectantly or with real fear, but when, as David Bell will argue, we ourselves are cyborgs. And as Donna Haraway will argue, it's not necessarily bad. Later on, Donna Haraway, like a really interesting thinker on media, technology, and politics, and a feminist thinker will say, really, feminism is the first cyborg consciousness in the world. Long before others got to understand the relationship between machines and bodies, feminism understood this and finds in the image of the cyborg not something to be disdained or be skeptical about, but something to be welcomed. Another British feminist, Sadie Plant, in her article on the Matrix, will also talk about this. She'll say, a women's way of seeing the world has in fact opened itself up to like really early intimations of understanding how computer-mediated cultures work. That feminism and understanding cyborgs really go hand in hand. She'll describe this as being she'll describe this as like early kinds of forms of image consciousness in some ways. So while the normal kind of male way of thinking and of representing the cyborg in movies is of these robotic, hulking, warring machines which are going to, at war, like RoboCop starts, I believe, was sort of like with machines at war against the human race itself. But this perspective that's in this book says that the cyborg is already here, that cyborgs are already inside us, that we are already wired deeply into machines in ways that are much more complicated, than can be simply sort of understood. And that the cyborgs have not come in terms of a utopian language of technology. Cyborg culture has come as business. That we are really wired into data business, whether we like it or not. And that's the dominant language of globalization. So what started out originally as a utopian language of technology, what is going to be our relationship to the machine, ends up only like a decade later that it's arrived, and it's arrived in these really kind of humdrum, normalized, grayed down kind of ways. It's arrived in terms of Microsoft. Like I've always been a Mac user, always faithful to Mac, this kind of fading group of people in some ways. Always despised Microsoft, but try to keep myself open as possible because programmers liked it. So I decided last year, well, I can't teach this if I don't really understand, PCs and stuff. So I went and bought one and, clumped it in my office and then chained myself down to use it, bemoaning the loss. So for a year, it's been like, a year of, of abstention from Macs and going over to PCs. And what I found with PCs was really interesting. I found that there's such a different politic of the two systems. And it's not even talking about Linux, is that the PC system, I was amazed when I just began just simple things like install, that suddenly it was like this whole very centralized system of authority. And that you found yourself almost having to seek permission to install. Every morning when I turn on the machine, I get little updates. We have your cyber upgrades ready to be installed. And I think to myself, how do they know what needs to be installed on my computer? And suddenly I realize that my computer is like this sort of like surveillance system of my actions, all for my own good, of course, to protect me against dangerous viruses around. And really have the system of Microsoft and of PCs as an operating system which really has about it a real language of control. And you say, well, this is just control with computers. But then I realize that this system of control with PCs means control of vast archives of data. Where is this data being streamed to? What are the language of cookies itself? And I just noticed about 2 days ago in the business pages to the New York Times that a series of countries in the world, including China, and I believe Finland and the European Union, in fact, have now, as a matter of public policy, have decided that they're going to throw the weight of their national governments in terms of the development of open operating systems like Linux, for one real reason, because they really fear that if the Microsoft operating system is allowed to continue to expand like the Borg, that this will have pernicious effects on the control of national economies itself. And so countries like China say, well, really the real language of power in the present and the future is the language of computer-mediated power, the language of who controls the data flows and who controls what data is going to be accumulated, what uses will be put to it, and also who is putting down the codes within computer systems itself. So suddenly what started as a utopian idea for open architecture, for freely distributed systems, suddenly becomes a way in which, very themselves powerful nations in the world like China have decided that they're going to fight back against the language of Western globalization itself. And so the language of computer technology suddenly becomes the language of, of empire politics and of resistance against empire politics itself. So in this book, as David Bell will say, the image of the cyborg is found most early and most graphically in cinematic representations, like cinema, like the Matrix in M and AI, or Memento, where it's really asked, Memento in the terms of asking the question, what happens to human memory in advanced technological cultures? What happens to the relationship between the camera as a substitute for memory and memory itself? And David Bell will say that the cyborg might be imagined like this in terms of its early representation, but it's actually practically realized in terms of coming inside us and wiring us to vast fields of data flows, and becomes a matter for just normal politics between different nations in the world itself. Thirdly, David Bell will say in the introduction that the machines that we're going to talk about are not, they're not necessarily alienated machines. We're going to talk about in this class machines which are really intimate to us. When we talk of media, we are not talking of a language of oppression, machines and outside of ourselves. We're talking of expressions of ways of human desiring and human imagination, and forms of representation of the world which don't stay outside of ourselves but become inside of ourselves. And machines which speak in a language of seduction, in a language of fascination, and in a language of paradox. And in the machines which really, really deeply organize us into these tribes. Like, have you been following the post-survivor shows? Do you watch these shows? And icon for, no one's going to confess you watch these shows. I watch them all. so, because I've been trying to figure out, well, what is this? Because it's like this new form of electronic intimacy. Like the show which I did not see, but I was reading just the reports on it, the choice of the icon for the day, the young woman who's chosen, her CD is going to be cut. She's flown from coast to coast in all the shows, and something like how many tens of millions of people watch the shows itself. It's really staggering numbers. And you had this kind of velocity of animation, of interest in the show itself. And I would say, well, what happens to contemporary culture that Survivor and post-Survivor shows these forms of like vicarious experience are not experienced as vicarious experience, but as real experience themselves. So during all these episodes, depending on the magnitude of the shows, that people, standing around the hallways will talk about characters. And then you realize they're not talking about friends, they're talking about their cyber friends, their very best cyber friends. And so I would just say, well, that sort of, David Bell would say that sort of would lead to the question, are we living in a culture of boredom? Or of our very best friends that we can really trust, or our televisual or our cyber friends? And what does that mean about the relationships and this intimacy of the machines themselves? Or what does it mean about the intimacy of machines that we have allowed ourselves to begin to visualize the end of the human species? There's lots of books today. There's lots of television shows about the age of the post-human itself. We are the human species, we're the one species that has begun to sort of imagine its end point. And almost through cinema begins to almost have a feeling of like great simultaneously anxiety and anxiousness to sort of crawl out of the skin and to imagine what comes next, sometimes with really evocative results. Like the film that I can't get out of my mind, like AI. And I know it's hocus pocus and everything. But the fundamental question of that film, can a mother reciprocate to the unrequited love of an artificial intelligence life form with full love and full reciprocity? Can a mother love a robot? Is the basic premise of that movie itself. Turns out she can and she can't. She still has a notion of the real. She still divides between the real sun and the artificial reality sun. So I think cinema is like, like a probe of the future and represents almost in terms of collective unconsciousness, terms of imagining and desiring and fears that we have, our own fears about technological culture within which we live. So there's a lot of text in this book about particular cinema. And we're going to update that hopefully in the class by just talking about contemporary cinema. I really would like to talk about Memento for sure. And I'd like to talk about Fight Club, which I've really been interested in terms of what their relationship is to this culture. But there's a lot of emphasis in this text given over to films. And if you like to write your paper like on films, go for it. That's really a good thing, an interesting thing to do. Who had their hand up? Did you?
Are you suggesting that this tendency to realize our own end is something anomalous not only to the human species, but to this time that it's been brought on by technology?
There's been lots of cultures that have had, like medieval cultures, which had like, the days of the death dance about them.
That's what I'm
And would begin, yeah.
Greek tragedy and
Yeah.
even mythology to talk about the god of the hells and so on. So
Yeah, I think that what I would suggest though is that the difference of a technological culture is that we in fact have the physical ability to will our own end. And the example that I would use is this, that I would say for myself the significance at the end of, when I was born, at the end of the Second World War, when atomic weapons were dropped in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And dropped by not a despotic culture, dropped by a culture that sees itself as a freedom culture, the lead liberal culture in the world, the United States, which found within its own project the justification for dropping atomic weaponry, and did two things: the weapons of genocide, but also did something in terms of time and space. It actually called an end to an unfolding sense of history. It said through atomic weaponry and what would follow another 50 years regime, political practice of mutually assured destruction, that human history literally could be brought to an end anytime we want. And it was really on people's, that's been my whole period of my life. until very recently. Living within the sense of, well, which mad person is going to really end the human race? And a lot of, like my daughter, a lot of students that I've known the years that I've been teaching have also had this oppressive sense in their mind. It's found in cinema, like River's Edge. River's Edge, I thought was really like a post-nuclear film. The kind of despondency that it has, where they're sitting around the body of their friend, which is lying on the shores of the river, and sort of like randomly distracted. Everybody's distracted in the movie. The mother comes on the scene and she says, when their child are asking, the kids ask her to do something, she says, who's got time to be, something to the effect, who's got time to be a mother? I'm bored with being a mother. And suddenly it turns out in the film, everybody's bored with everything else. The film, almost like this fear, which turns into a culture of distraction itself. So I would just suggest that in a technological culture, we technologically have the ability, and had it for 50 years, to literally end human history. And another very good thinker, Paul Virilio, another French thinker who's written any number of very good short books on technology, says something else which really stuck in my mind. He says, we're the culture that's not content to play around with nature to our own ends, play around with our own bodies, play around with communication, but we're the culture which plays around with space and time. The great references within which we live, space and time. And we no longer have, like just a sense of time as duration and unfolds and the time of the human body, but we now have a thing called real time. We divide time itself, and we begin to talk about real time as net time, as data time, in which the concept of time is having something in relationship to a context, an individual human life or the collective memories of a people. It just sort of like vanished away, and suddenly it becomes the time of digital bits, zeros and ones itself, or of space. We are a culture of speed, and technology prides itself being in a culture of speed. About 2 years ago, there is a scientific experiment performed at Harvard University by physicists, in which they managed to slow down the speed of light. About a year ago, they slowed it down to 50 miles an hour. And then about 2 months ago, they slowed it down to about 1 mile an hour. They actually used new technologies to actually take control of the speed of light itself. And immediately they began thinking of, as Bill Gates would say, well, what are the killer apps that will follow from this? And when I read that, I didn't think, what are the killer consumer apps that will follow from that? I thought, well, what a tragedy. That, the great reference that we've had, time and space, and, the sense of space as having relationship to bodies and cultures and the times within which we live, suddenly become just objects of technological experimentation. What will really be the end of this? That was the sense in which I meant technology as having about it the ability to end things. And then when I just flip my reading and then just go into the text, mostly based at Harvard University, which has been such a creative center for molecular biology and genetic engineering. You should go to those texts and read what the scientists are doing, and then go to the lab reports, which are up on the web. And the people, the companies that are dealing in recombinant genetics, and just read literally the language by which they speak of the human body and of the human future. For them, it's nothing more than a freebase experiment in wildcat genetic modification. Why shouldn't we have, in their terms, why shouldn't we be replaced by a culture of transgenics, as they like to say, improved beings who could be fabricated, if you're going to have a factory job, to have like body parts literally grown on you that will fit the machine that you're using. Or if for space travel, why do you need legs? Legs have always been a big impediment for space travel. It takes up too much space. Why not try to design a body which is more like a ball and can sort of float within space itself and won't have ganglia? Or what would be the Homer Simpson kind of body of the future? They're like literally, and they give us these improvements in terms of the language of facilitation. It's for our own good. It'll produce better babies. It'll produce better health, better knowledge. But always, I would say, the second double whammo is that no sooner do you accept these, then suddenly we get the language of control. There are strategies behind these. There are companies which operate. And to read these molecular biologists and genetic engineers, again coming out of the most advanced universities of Western culture, is to really go back, for myself, and just my own opinion, is to go back to like a updated version of National Socialism. It's a third order of fascism. It's the roots of the eugenic experiments of National Socialism did not lie in Germany. If you go back and read the history of eugenics, the history of what happened in National Socialism lay in the experiments in new mental hygiene, improving an improved species through things like castration of men and sterilization of women. Took place in most states of the United States and took place actually in Canada in the province of Alberta until the 1970s. It was only the advent of the Second World War and the really pejorative relationships between eugenic experimentation and fascism, that whole reading, that whole connection was silenced. And it's only been the last several years that people have gone back and said, why? There's a striking similar connections here. Where do things begin to originate? And I think that its newest tendency in technology, in genetic modification, really has such deep ties to two previous forms of eugenic experimentation. And I just find that really dangerous, because it really is a technological experiment which is premised on the end of the human species, and it really has, it's pejorative in terms of human dignity and human autonomy. So it's not to say that it's new, but it's an old tendency which is almost appearing in definitive form almost. So that's just my perspective on that. Okay. Yeah, I've really been, digitality is one thing, but when you get into the language of molecular biology and genetic engineering, and that's not a free-form criticism of scientists, but the dominant tendencies in that discipline today really need to be thought about, and they're not being thought within science. If you're like a wonderful thinker like a guy named Lowenthal, who wrote this book, Biology as Ideology, writing out of Harvard, I thought was really courageous. The book is marginalized, because it says really, if you look at this discipline, it's an ideology masquerading as a theory of knowledge, and perhaps should be thought about. Well, just to go back to this, David Bill in his introduction is asking sort of similar questions, because he's saying that if we're going to think about media and politics and technology, then we shouldn't let the broader concerns of culture and society be on the outside, but we should think in terms of what power has to do with these forms of representation and what they mean in terms of the end of human history. And for example, does the spread of a technological culture have anything to do with boredom? There's some thinkers now who would say the dominant sensibility or attunement of our culture is complete sheer boredom, deep boredom. And a thinker that comes to mind, a German thinker, Martin Heidegger, said, well, if you think of a culture of boredom, then you better be very careful, because monsters come out of a culture of boredom. And I think that bears in some of the readings that we're going to have in the book. The final introduction, which is done by Barbara Kennedy, she's also out of Britain, is called The Virtual Machine, and I thought it's a really interesting introduction in sort of two respects, because she's very different than David Bill, because David Bill wants to talk about the cyborg and intimate machines, and those are all really good questions. But Barbara Bill sort of turns it back, and she asks sort of like the hard kind of cyberpunk question. And the question that she asks is this. She says, why is technology always so deeply associated with crashes? Why is technology always so deeply implicated with death? And she says, why are we always so interested in crashes and death itself? And she uses examples of like James Dean, Princess Di. And of course we can add our own new examples. The World Trade Center, TWA Flight 800. From literature, Ballard's crash itself, or the Concorde. There's another thinker, Paul Virilio again, who says that to understand the story of technology, we really should pay attention to crash. to the wreckage of technology. He says, because that's also an important part of the story. He said it's an important part of the story. He says because the creation of any new technology always presupposes a new kind of crash is going to happen or a new kind of disturbance. If you get trains, you're going to have train crashes. If you get planes, you're going to have splattered Boeings on the earth. If you have electronic stock markets, you can just bet that you're going to have a big electronic crash in which all the data is crashed itself. And sometimes you have like the perfectly cybernetic body that happens to sing a song with a beautiful voice like Elvis Presley. At some point you're going to have a body crash. Have you ever seen those scenes of Elvis Presley in his last Las Vegas days? You know, he's the perfect cyborg, eh? He's wired for sound. He's sung the songs 1,000 times. His voice is not his own anymore. It's just sort of a register which goes out over the airwaves itself. And he sort of, takes the microphone and sticks it down his throat. He sort of slurs the voice of the songs itself. He's completely drug-ridden, doesn't really know where he is. He even forgets the name of the words to the songs. Love Me Tender. He has to turn around and talk to the band and say, what are the words, boys? And they feed him the words to sort of keep him going for one day. And you say, well, I'm not at a music concert, I am at a crash. It's like the zombie culture of the living dead in some ways. And maybe this is the future of the body that just becomes irretrievably bored with itself, acting out a certain role itself. Or as Barbara Kennedy would say, but what also accounts for our fascination with the crash? Crashes aren't particularly oppressive. They have a certain seduction about it. Is the seduction about the crash that simply it's an inevitable consequence of technology, or is the seduction of the crash something else? Is it, as Virilio will argue and some of the readings will do, is that what really keeps the technological culture going, what keeps it interesting, what keeps it animating, is the possibility of the crash. That none of us are really interested in the perfectly functioning car. We're much more interested in the car with that cracked windshield going into an accident scene. Or Don DeLittle's White Noise, where the pilot comes on the air to say, this plane's going down, this plane's going to crash, this plane is a gleaming, beaming death machine. It's going down. And as you read the passage itself, you pick out the horror of the crash, but you also say, well, let's be truthful, there's also the element of fascination within the crash itself. So could it be, the question that Barbara Kennedy asks, could it be that part of our fascination with living in the technological culture is that a technological culture also has about it the scent of death? That for all of the utopian ambitions about cyberculture, that cyberculture is always one big crash waiting to happen. And it's sort of, it's fitting to talk about this today a little bit because we live 1 year to the day from a crash, from 9/11. We've lived interminably through postmortems on the crash itself. And the only question that is not being asked is why the fascination with the crash? Why at the moment that 9/11 happened, by the end of the day, I don't know if your experience was like mine, but as you watch CNN for the 1,000th time, going through the same scene of the plane hitting the skyscrapers, once you go beyond feelings of tragedy to feelings of, like some of you have said, of numbness, and then even to another feeling of nausea itself. Did you ever ask yourself the question, what is the fascination of the media with the crash itself? Is in fact the scent of failure that which keeps the technology going? And some of the articles in this book are going to go back on that and really talk of the deeper origins of technological culture. The origins or the relationship of technology to what Freud called thanatos, to the death instinct itself. And that's a terrible sort of thing to say, because if you're a tech utopian and you like systems to keep functioning, you don't want to sort of hear that. But other thinkers who think about technology like Paul Virilio sort of make that a sort of a foregrounded sense. And the reason that Barbara Kennedy asked that is that Barbara Kennedy writes this introduction really autobiographically. Barbara Kennedy writes this introduction as a person who herself was in a terrible car crash. And she says this, She says, you know, the car crashes. I was propelled by massive voltage waves through the air at 60 miles an hour. I was swirling in a vortex. I was unsure whether this was real or whether I was only dreaming, a dream which became too real, too human. When I hit the metal road sign at full velocity, at escape velocity, my body just stopped. Then it landed in a soft, mossy earth, another place, another woman's zone, an imperceptible zone, a return to the garden. I woke up sort of like with nature in my face, with dirt in my mouth, the sky above me, and metal and glass and ferns and flowers. And I became flesh in the body of a woman. And I said, what is this woman? And when I really woke up in the hospital, in the intensive care unit, I came to consciousness and realized that everything that I was writing about suddenly was my own story, that I literally was a cyborg in intensive care. I became a machinic pattern. Certainly when there was a point during the crash when I was no longer a subject. My subjectivity was rendered useless. My body was lost. It was immobile. I lost my identity. I was immobile. I was in intensive care. I found myself waking up and knowing my own organs and my own life processes by flickering data screens on the cyborg cybernetic screens all around me, if you've been in intensive care units itself. I was wired within the machines, and I wanted to be wired within the machines because the machines were also my only possibility for life itself. I was a willing servo mechanism of machinic culture. So really, Barbara Kennedy starts to write about technology and cyborg culture as a woman's body that's wired to the machine that experiences her own crash. And she then begins to write the introduction out of what that experience of crash is. And she asks then in conclusion sort of the larger question, is her body in the intensive care unit, or her body in the intensive care unit which wakes up wiring and which depends on machines to tell it how she's living and how well she's living, or is her body after the crash in this kind of moment of inertia in which she's got like flowers and ferns in her face and glass around her eyes and sort of flickering scenes of the sky above? Is really this not just a story of her own autobiography, but is this a story of what has happened to us in technological culture? And so Barbara Kennedy begins to write the introduction. She says, we are not living before the crash. Technological culture has already crashed. It has already literally crashed inside our perception, inside our ears, inside our imagination, inside our economy and our politics, inside of the ways we see and think about the world. And so what we really are is collectively students of post-crash. And we experience some things in common. Numbness seems to be a prevailing sensibility. Distraction certainly a prevailing sensibility, but also real sense of anxiety and fear, but also really intense feelings of fascination and seduction. So we wake up in the intensive care unit of contemporary culture. Technology has crashed into our bodies. We have become cyborgs. And the point would be then as thinkers to say, well, what is the price for this? What is gained and what is lost? Next week we'll begin the readings on what is gained and what being lost by speaking of the gains with these really two nice articles by, I just get the right section, two nice articles on Michael Benedict's, which is page 29, Cyberspace First Steps. And then I would ask you to go to, well then, Sean Wilbur's An Archaeology of Cyberspaces. And the contrasting vision then to that is Arturo Escobar's Welcome to Siberia, but particularly Kevin Robbins' Cyberspace in the World We Live In. So the two contrasting articles in this section is Michael Benedict's Cyberspace First Steps and Kevin Robbins' Cyberspace in the World We Live In. So if you don't mind for next week, maybe you could read those two articles in particular. Just try to read them closely. Come to class, and then rather than having a lecture class next week, we'll have a discussion on the readings itself. And when you read Benedict, just see what you find either seductive about his reading or from your own point of view critical about the reading. And hopefully we'll have more discussion next week. Okay, good.